Keeping my values and my culture alive it's been difficult at times. I'm in the process right now of making a cradle board for my first grandchild. I'm so excited.
A cradle board is a frame, it's a structure that is oftentimes woven. It can be made out of wood, it can be made out of plant fiber, and it is used to carry and transport and contain babies.
I was raised in cradle boards. My dad was raised in a cradle board. We had a family one that my aunt has. A lot of us were raised in. And it's a tradition in our family. I didn't get to learn how to do this after my children were born. So this is the first time I actually get to make one for my grandchild. Putting a baby in the cradle board and bringing the baby home was very important, and I heard stories in my family how that's a tradition. They put the baby in the cradle board, they bring him home, that's their first journey into life. So seat belts were becoming a big thing in car seats, and I was having a hard time putting him in a car seat and not be the first generation not to bring him home in a cradle board. That was really hard. So his dad figured it out. We had an old Model A pickup, and he said, I'll just bring the Model A because you don't have to have car seats in it. It's too old.
Well, the cradle board really embodies the tribe and the family, so that when babies are born, there's already somebody who has lovingly gone out into nature to find all of the types of materials that are needed with good thoughts, and also to give thanks to the earth and all that she provides.
My name's Don Hankins, and I'm Plains Miwok. I started weaving back in the late 90s, and I'm also an associate professor at Chico State in the Department of Geography and Planning. I'm also the field director for the Butte Creek Ecological Reserve. Really in an interesting position because of the memorandum that we have with the Machupta. I like to hold that up and say, look, we've got an obligation to manage our resources for the tribe. They're really the tribe's resources.
Some of the people here today still live on the lands that their ancestors lived on, which is a remarkable and a wonderful thing. And so they're very intimately knowledgeable about their environment and how the earth provides for their needs, including basket-making material.
You know, there's a lot of people who believe that there's areas of the landscape that shouldn't be managed. You know, if you look at the Spanish journals, they're talking about these kind of park-like settings. That didn't take very long for those systems to change, because if we look at Fremont, when Fremont had come through California, he described certain areas along the riparian corridor as being these dense thickets. Well, you have to keep in context that Fremont came through after populations were decimated in a lot of these areas. The idea of a wilderness, I guess in the sense of it being wild, includes people in California at least. There are certainly probably places elsewhere in the West and elsewhere in the world where people didn't have as big of an impact, but for the most part, California was very heavily managed.
There's a lot of work to do before you even start picking or gathering. Part of having a site where you're going to make baskets or have good willow is making sure the area is clean and taken care of year by year, because each year your willow gets stronger, leaner, and that's exactly what you want.
The teaching process really starts from being a steward of the resource, knowing the ecology of the plants and how to gather them so that you're not impacting them and you're treating them well, all the way out to the production of basketry. And I think in the old days, that knowledge process for how do you become a weaver started at an early age. You'd go out and help people to collect, and then slowly you would get into the process of weaving yourself.
A lot of it is observation, that the younger generation, if they follow in the traditional way of learning, that they watch. And they don't even ask many questions. They just watch and they observe. On
a snowy day, you know, we had nothing else to do, and I was sitting with my grandparents. I said, hey, you want to show me how to weave? And my grandmother said, yeah, I'll show you how to weave. So that's how I got started. I guess I kind of consider myself fortunate in the sense that At the time period I was growing up, there were a lot of older people that were still around at that time. I would love to go and hear their stories and learn what they had to share. And I think a lot of my knowledge and my interest really came from that. Part of the reason why I wanted to learn to make cradle boards was so that when I had kids, I'd be able to use them. I wanted to be able to give that back to my kids. When my daughter was born, I had all the materials collected and ready to go, and in the days after she was born, I constructed her cradle board. Both of my daughters had that done within the first week of their life.
Lillian Snooks, she's Pit River. We went to her house, and she was very guarded. When I showed up, she wanted to show my friend how to make the baskets, but she wasn't sure who I was and didn't want to show me. She didn't know if I was Pit River. She didn't want to show me if I wasn't from her tribe. And then I showed up, and she started asking me first words as an Indian person, "Who's your family?" And I said, "Oh, my family's the Laurys from Susanville." She goes, "Who?" And I said, "Stan Laurie is my dad." She looked at me and said, "My daughter." She had a huge crush on my dad at boarding school.
There was a very concentrated effort by the U.S. government to send children away to boarding schools and to make them acculturated, to make them like the white man, and forbade them from speaking their own language or carrying on their traditions, and that included cradleboard making. So it wasn't until they came back to their tribes after this type of education that they had to unlearn some of the things they'd learned in white society and relearn or remember their traditions. The ones who'd gone to boarding schools and their children are the ones that probably feel the strongest need and vibrancy infused into carrying the traditions on.
My decision for putting my kids in the cradle board was really an easy one for me. I wanted to continue that with my kids. I felt proud putting them in there. I felt that I could express who I was.
And the thing that's so wonderful about baby cradles are they're so transportable, so that babies can go everywhere with their parents. Ceremonies and social activities, and they're not at ground level. They're right up at the same eye level as adults and everybody else.
My oldest daughter, she slept in her cradle board for about 4 months before she outgrew it and loved it, absolutely loved being in the cradle board.
They take in so much of their culture by this positioning and this vantage point that they have from the cradle board. I've seen pictures of babies in cradle boards that have been put in trees. They're actually hung in trees so that they can see what their mom's doing instead of just laying on the ground on their back.
Around, as we walked around, we would carry her in the cradle board and she would just fall asleep. If we were working outside, we could prop it up, in the garden, and she could watch what we're doing, and it was a perfect place for her.
I'd put her in, and she'd be fussing, and I'd get her nice and tight, and I'd kind of rock her. She'd be out for hours and hours, and I could get my housework done, cook dinner. So it was really nice. It was very nice, and I just can't see how anybody could live without them.
Cradle boards do help bridge the gaps because we're talking about life. We're talking about babies, we're talking about next generation, and there will always be babies and generations that will follow. And what better way to celebrate that than to have these cradle boards?
So land access is a really big issue for a lot of weavers, and this really ties directly back to settlement, where people were removed from the land, their homelands, and where their families have been tending to specific patches for generations. With private land ownership, people not having access to those places, only about a third of the state is public lands. A lot of weavers are kind of creating gardens in their own backyards. So you've got people who maybe have a quarter-acre lot, their house is situated on it, and they'll plant Santa Barbara sedge and maybe some other cultural plants like dogbane in their backyards to have at least a small supply to be able to start with for weaving.
We developed a place down in Woodland, Cache Creek Reserve, and used to be an old mining gravel pit, and now it's a basket weaver's garden.
they've actually planted a tending and gathering garden, which is actually an educational garden for Native people to come in and teach and use those resources.
It's a collaboration between the ranchers, the city and county, and the basket weavers.
A lot of landowners who know that they have cultural resources, cultural plant resources on their properties are really excited about the opportunities of having weavers come up to their lands and collect. You know, the ability to go out isn't always there. Most of the lands that are potentially open for weavers to go out and collect basketry resources being held by private individuals. And you know, you see these no trespassing signs all over the place.
Well, when the willow starts popping or it starts separating and you got to go get it right away, so you got a window of 2 weeks. So if you're working, you're not going to be able to just jump off your job and go get that. That's what they face, you know, not being able to get there or do the burn at the time, because you might have to be there for a weekend to do a burn on an area, or a week to make sure it's safe. So it's hard. It's really hard. So we're finding people like me that are now retired are the ones doing the weaving and trying to keep this up. I go to teach the young women. It's hard because that's their complaint. I don't have time. This is really hard. I really, really want to do this, but I have family, I have a job, I have a house to clean, I have, you know, all these different things. The kids have sports. And so that society that we're trying to live in those two worlds, it really collides a lot.
I taught at DQ University. Some of the elders who I would have expected had grown up with this knowledge don't have it. And so I'm actually sharing that knowledge back out within the community to teach elders how to weave and their grandchildren how to weave.
Getting them started, at least they have some knowledge of it. They can make a small one, look at it, know the materials, go out and find an area, or I would show them different areas of where to get willow, redbud, chokecherry. That's the biggest part, is finding a site. Getting them connected with the California Basket Weaving Association, which is we call CEBA, was another big one. It's like, these are where your master weavers are. These are the people you need to go see and talk to find if you're Pit River and I'm Maidu, or if you're Pomo and I'm Maidu, I can help on some of it, but I don't know everything about your culture or how to make your kind of cradle boards, so I'll hook them up with somebody who does. The one thing about the redbud is they have seeds here, and they usually come down, but the thing with redbud is you need a hot fire to go through to open up these seed pods to propagate this plant. So when they're here and we coppice them down, we're just going to get this plant until we get a nice fire to get these started. So that's why in the forest, a fire is not always a bad thing.
Traditional burning, the practice has actually been on the decline since Spaniards arrived in California in the 1700s. The Spanish actually had policies they put in place that disallowed Native people from burning.
You have to get an oak fork, so you have to go around and look, and they're not easy to find. In the past, they would take and burn an area, and then within about 1, 2, maybe 3 years, they'll have all these little shoots coming up, and you're going to be looking for those forks that the tree will naturally grow in.
As Europeans came into California, most Europeans who were moving into the area had no tradition of burning. They had long lost it. I kept hearing stories of weavers saying, well, I'd love to get the land managers to burn so that we can have better materials to weave with. Helping to identify places where maybe a basket weaver wants to come in and burn willows. You know, we'll identify those areas with the weaver and then work towards putting fire on the ground to improve the quality of the sticks for the baskets. And then also as a teaching tool to bring out tribal members to teach them a little bit about fire. To the general public, we also use it as a format of showing them the difference between, say, normal prescribed fire, cultural burning practice, and wildfire. And that in order to produce healthy baskets and have that culture, you've got to be out on the landscape taking care of it. And when you're out taking care of that landscape, then you yourself will be healthy. Indigenous people who are allowed to go back out on country, manage the land, you know, walking around and setting fires to areas and going out to harvest foods and things like that, helps to keep people active. Being able to participate in land management is definitely something that helps to keep people healthy. A lot of the social science research that's out there suggests that the public is really supportive of prescribed fire, and it seems that the agencies haven't quite caught on to this idea.
We use our mouth a lot with a lot of the products, and so I have to find a pesticide-free area. That's hard. A lot of stuff is sprayed. A lot of stuff in the forest is sprayed. Caltrans you don't want to pick alongside the highway, even though it looks beautiful, because they come by and they coppice it and it's really beautiful, but I don't know what they sprayed on it.
If there are residues that are left on a plant, the problems that it would pose is that a weaver who's using their own mouth to split the materials, or if a basket, say, is used for cooking, then that might allow for the release of those chemicals to be passed to the weaver or be passed to people who are using that basket for food.
It's not that easy to go and harvest whatever materials you need for making cradle boards, and how really toxic some of these pesticides and other chemicals that the federal government through the Forest Service are spraying on plants, or even Caltrans to keep the weeds down. And it really has made it very difficult for people who use these materials to harvest them and to use them because they are so toxic.
In some areas along the riparian corridors, like where willows might be collected, they might use rodeo or the aquatic equivalent of Roundup. A lot of times people will put a purple dye in that so that it can be identified in areas where they've been using it. But the roadside areas are a problem, and the forested areas where people are collecting.
My responsibility is to teach the kids nowadays in the schools how to live green, how to take care of the environment, to know as they grow up, they're going to be a senator or a congressman. I want them to look at the pesticides in our area.
Northern California, fortunately, the Native American population did not get as severely impacted as further south in California, like with emissions and with larger populations.
In the 4th grade, the kids have to make a diagram of a mission. Our mission, I have to tell it, our mission was, when we did our mission, we put a graveyard next to it with all these Indian people in it. And then we had the priest on the horse with a whip. So,
it was true to form. Yeah. It was more true than any other thing that we'd seen.
Some of the teachers talked to me. It's like, well, Mila did a nice job, but I don't know how we feel about this. And it's like, it's truth. It's the truth.
The new take on being Native, like the Twilight books, the vampire books, pretty interesting actually. The Quileutes, they'd have their own website where they had to state facts like we do not shift change. And when the books become so large and such a top seller, it's even harder to break away from the stereotype. But no, we don't shift change.
Well, you get these people that want to basically think that there's magic in Indian people. We're no magical than anybody else. I find from the time my kids were little, everybody knew that my daughter's kids or my son had a Native American mom, so they would come and ask me to bring in materials, baskets, tell stories. Coyote was a big helper in creating humans. And he's a trickster, but he also is a helper of making us. He gave us our belly buttons, because as we were being cooked on the earth, Creator told Coyote, don't mess with the humans, and he just couldn't wait, and so he poked us on the belly and to see if we were done, and that's how we got our belly buttons.
Youth today are finding ways that will enable them to walk in these two or in these many worlds, and that through these traditions, if they choose to learn them and practice them, that gives them an even greater ability to ground themselves.
Well, I plan to keep a lot of the traditions that my mom taught me alive. I hope to keep my kids in cradle boards when I have kids. My mom and my uncle are so good at making them and crafting them, but I really hope that one day I'll put them in cradle board.
There's a story called The Butterfly Woman. She ends up leaving the baby in the woods and following a butterfly. She wants to capture the butterfly. And so she follows it, and then pretty soon the butterfly turns into a man. And he says, you have to follow me, but I'm going to take you through Butterfly Valley, and you need to hang on to me and don't look at anything. Just hang on to me, or I'll lose you forever. Well, she decides to follow him and hangs on to him, and as she's going through, she feels the flutter of the butterflies around her. And so eventually she looks and she sees a beautiful one, and then she sees a prettier one, and then a prettier one. The next thing she's grabbing for them. Next thing she knows, she's letting go of him. He keeps going, and she's lost forever in that butterfly land. Sometimes we forget who we are and our responsibilities, like our children, and we always are chasing that extra dream that, you know, if we would just stay put sometimes and understand the beauty in our families is just as beautiful as the butterfly.